In and finding your seat. We're going to get started here in just a minute. So come on in. I'll be reading Carlus's bio that he sent to us. So Carlus Gupton from Nashville. Come on in.
Get the crew on in. I'll go sheepdog.
Great to see so many of you out again, and many of you I haven't seen for quite a few years, 3 years probably, some of us. But Carlus grew up playing the trombone, singing, and acting. This presumed call to entertainment arts was profoundly redirected by his conversion at age 17 and a small congregation that welcomed him as their teen preacher. This led to training at Freed-Hardeman University, Lipscomb University, where he got his bachelor's degree, Harding School of Theology, his MDiv, and Abilene Christian University, his DMin. He spent 20 years as lead minister for congregations from 80 to 800 people before transitioning into teaching leadership, conflict, and spiritual formation. He taught at Johnson University, then at the University of Tennessee School of Communication Studies. He was also professor of ministry, director of field education, and co-director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Harding School of Theology from 2014 to 2020. He's currently assistant dean, professor of ministry, and director of the Doctor of Ministry program at Lipscomb University of Theology. Dr. Gupton has consulted with churches for 25 years. He has expertise in numerous forms of congregational development. He's an ICF credentialed coach and is certified in an extensive suite of psychometric instruments for leadership and team effectiveness. He published 2 websites, lifeandleadership.com and discpersonalitysource.com. Carlus and Ann have been married for 38 years, have 2 grown daughters, Caitlin, David Nowers, and Aaron. He reads voraciously, loves listening to music, enjoys Star Trek and Ken Burns documentaries, and runs to the tunes of the 70s classic rock music. So we'd like to see that sometime, Carlus. But we are in for a great treat. If you haven't heard Carlus before, he will be giving us a tremendous amount of information and do a wonderful job. Carlus, come and speak to us.
Is it on? 1, 2, on, 1, 2, on.
There we are.
Good. Okay. You need to have one of these. You got one of these?
Yeah.
They're being distributed. That's important. I always love coming to Montana, and I'm just thankful you guys are not tired of me. I've been around a lot. In fact, the last time I flew was in May to speak at the men's retreat over here in Montana. And Bob and I spent more time on the road than he probably wanted to spend time with me during that time, but it was great. It was just a wonderful time. Really enjoyed being with everyone, and got to see the beautiful state of Montana. And I flew in this time and saw it again, all covered with snow. But you guys are accustomed to that, I think. Now, before I even get started, I want to warn you about something. I have never, ever been told that I have an hour and 45 minutes to speak. I mean, that's like, I don't know, it's like IHOP pancakes. I had IHOP pancakes for lunch, okay? So, that is like sugar, syrup. I don't know what you call it. It's just nice to hear. I got an hour and 45 minutes. Well, I won't keep you that long, I promise. Now, to help, if it helps at all, I got one of these Fitbit gadgets, right? Okay. And I've set a timer. And so I know when my first session will have covered 45 minutes, and I'll just speak 15 or 20 minutes beyond it. But at least I will know. I will be watching at that point to see whether the body is enduring, so that the mind can still absorb. Well, I've been asked to speak about the relationship between elders and ministers. And I think the impetus on this, if I'm remembering right, and talking with Scott Laird at one point, it was the idea, there's Scott, okay. I presented this at the Harding Lectures, okay. Now this is a little different version. It is like a bowl of warmed over homemade soup. It is better the second time around, but I added an ingredient or two. Okay, so it's not completely the old version. There have been a few additions and no deletions, but there have been a few additions and changes and that sort of thing. Now, you have an awful lot more here in this little handout than I will be able to cover, as is pretty typical for me. But I do think it hits a lot of the areas where just based, and in all honesty, a lot of this is just based on my experience. It's based on my experience of training ministers, sending them out, working with elders who work with the preachers that we send out, watching that relationship unfold, and then getting lots of Facebook messages, which is where about a third or a half of my consulting work originates. Somebody sends me a message, hey, I didn't have your email, but help! And so I'll get this, message where somebody says, I'm struggling, I don't know what to do, I understand you do a little bit of coaching, will you coach me through my decision to just quit? Something like that. And not uncommonly, and I would say this is no exaggeration. Those who preach will be able to confirm this. Ask any of them. If you get a group of ministers from the churches of Christ together in a room and you provide a safe environment for them to talk about their fundamental frustrations relative to their work, it will not take 5 minutes for them to be talking about their relationships with their elders. I mean, all you got to do is just give them a little bit of safety. Just give them a little bit of safety to discuss that, and that's where it will go. I mean, it's just... That's foolproof. That is going to happen. There's no way around the truth of that. And I work some with Hope Network. Several of us in here, Everett and Jason and I are a part of Hope Network, where we have, I guess, around 18 of us who circulate among churches and try to help on various things. And when we get together for our retreat next week down in Houston, my guess is if we talk about the thing we have to cover the most often when we go in to help churches, it's this issue. In one form or another, this issue comes up. Now, most elderships don't punctuate it in quite the same way. And in fact, a lot of the elders where I'll get a call from the ministers and they're not enjoying it, if I were to just strike up a conversation with the elders and say, how's your relationship with your preachers going? They'd say, it's great. Excuse me. It was this, I promise, okay? That was not the IHOP working on me, okay? But if you ask the elders, they'll say, it's fine, it's great. So it's a good team. Yeah, it's great. The elders make the decisions and the ministers work real hard carrying them out. So you see, the way they're punctuating it is, we're a great team. We're the coaches, we meet, we send the guys out to the field, and from the sidelines we kind of go back and forth, and occasionally the quarterback does an audible, but for the most part we're together on the game plan. And for them, a lot of them, that means a good team. Well, the ministers are thinking, no, I'd rather be in the room where we're drawing the X's and the O's. I'd rather be working on the chalkboard with the elders. I don't want to have to be on the gridiron looking over there at the sideline and constantly wondering whether I'm getting it right and wanting a team relationship. And I find the coaches, elders, huddling together with their backs turned toward me. And so here we are, we're out there and we're trying to play the game, but now sometimes when elders will hear that, they'll think, well, they just want to be the head guys. No? I don't know many ministers who want that. You have a few who have Baptist and Christian church envy. Baptist pastor envy, independent Christian church envy. They look, I taught school for the independent Christian churches for a number of years. I know a lot of ministers within the independent Christian churches. The grass is not any greener, it's just a different set of weeds. I just know our weeds better. Kind of like, Johnson grass just a little easier to handle than crabgrass, right? I know that's Tennessee language. Y'all have Johnson grass around here? Okay, whatever you have, whatever weed you have that grows in your lawn where you have to have somebody come treat your grass, right? But I hear a lot of guys who, some of them who want that, it's called the higher fire role. They want to be the senior minister and have control over the staff and that kind of thing. You hear that for the most part, but I will tell you, you get 10 guys, 10 Church of Christ ministers in a room somewhere. Yes, I know that's dangerous, but you get 10 Church of Christ ministers in a room somewhere, and you say, do you want to be the head guy and have higher fire and all that? You'll get no. They don't want that. What they want is a consistent place at the table of leadership. They just want a consistent place at the table. And so there is this tension between elders and ministers in the Church of the Christ. Now, I don't know how long it's been going. Some of you who've worked with churches longer than I have, you might know how long that has been going. My guess is it's been quite some time. But I think, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think the frustration has grown as the level of training among our ministers has grown. I may be wrong on that. Now, don't blame that on training and say, well, training's a bad thing. No, the training's great. The ministers in the Church of the Christ are some of the best trained ministers in any group. And I'm dead serious about that. I don't know what the real count is. Everett, you may know the actual count. I think there are 9 Master of Divinity granting institutions in the Church of the Christ. Something like that. 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, something like that. That's a lot. Per capita, that's more than a whole lot of Protestant groups have. Well, I don't know. The way Protestant groups are declining, I'm not sure in terms of per capita, but we have a lot of training grounds for ministers, and the training they're receiving has elevated over time. It's just gotten better and better and better. It's really good training, and so most of them come with really great ideas and great capacity, and when they don't have a place at the leadership table, it's frustrating because they don't get an opportunity to activate what they know or to share with the elders what they know. And all of this frustration begins to build up, and it's part of the reason. I think it's probably, we don't have hard, fast statistics on this. I don't know that anyone's done a study on it, but my guess is for the vast majority of ministers in the Church of the Christ who get out, this is the fundamental reason. It may not be the stated reason why they pull away, but it is the lived out reason why many of them pull away. So, with that in mind, what I've tried to do with this handout that I've given you is I've tried to mention the most common tension points. And I've tried to then describe it and then to suggest some strategies and best practices. Okay? And out of fairness, I want to start with the tension points as the elders perceive them first. That's on page 5. So we're going to go to page 5 and then come back, okay? I want to mention some tension points as the elders perceive them. And again, this is based on my experience and the people that I've talked to, for many years and the training that I've done. The likelihood is, though, that if I sat down with this, one more time and did another revision, I would probably be able to find 1 or 2 more tension points in terms of the way the elders perceive them, okay? So I'm not saying this is exhaustive, but it is certainly representative, okay? So here's one. This is a tension point in the relationship between elders and ministers, but particularly as the elders perceive them, and that is, number one, poor response to feedback. Poor response to feedback. Now look at the description I've given you there. Elders usually struggle with offering feedback to ministers. Any elders in here? Now, might be, you don't have to raise your hand because your minister may be sitting next to you, okay? Elders usually struggle on how to give feedback to ministers. I get that call a lot. Many are aware of the need not to overgeneralize, to be specific, etc. In fact, elders rarely communicate all the criticism they hear from members. This may come as a surprise to ministers. Okay? But when they do give feedback in a kind manner, they encounter oversensitivity, obfuscation, and at times, no measurable change. That can be frustrating. Let me give you an example. We have spent time with the minister trying to help him understand the need to elevate, really bump up the quality of the content of his sermons. His sermons are just theologically weak. He is a fine speaker, and he keeps the attention of everyone, but his content just simply is not very good. Now, he visits among the members and is wonderful in pastoral care. And so he has this beautiful relationship with the church, and they all love him, but they do not benefit from his preaching. They are not fed by his preaching. And so we've met with him over the past 2 or 3 years, and we have asked him to get training. We have been willing to pay for his theological training. We devoted $5,000 a year to his budget for theological training so he could ratchet up his way of understanding Scripture, his way to be able to understand the larger theological picture of Scripture, and eventually for that to be able to come out. And we even know that there's kind of a gestation period there, that it may take a year or two for us to really see that benefit, because you can't get it straight out of the chute after you just had 1 or 2 classes. Well, how's that turned out? He said he would enroll, but he never even enrolled. He never even enrolled in anything. We made suggestions to him, and he wouldn't do it. He just kind of keeps on preaching the same stuff. And one of us was listening to his sermons, and we thought we had heard it on a podcast somewhere, and lo and behold, we had. And so not only is it shallow, it's plagiarized. What are we supposed to do on that? And I said, well, I think it's a good case for involuntary termination. I mean, I'll just be honest, I think it is. They said, well, if we do that, the church will kill us because they love it. You see that dilemma that they are in? They really do need him to listen to the feedback. And they're willing to devote themselves to his growth. Man, if I'd been working for a church and they said, we'll pay you $5,000 a year above your salary, we'll give you a credit card to go out and go to seminary for as much as you want during that time, and here's $5,000 to do it. Man, that would be like telling a speaker he's got 1 hour and 45 minutes to speak. It'd be even better than that, right? Whoa, man. Well, what are some best practices? Well, is to understand, and I'm kind of addressing this to the ministers in a sense, most other professions receive very specific feedback with expectations of growth plans. I do. I mean, I have to, as a professor, I have to fill stuff out every year. And every one of my classes is evaluated by the students. Keep going. It's most often anonymous, too, and at times quite unfair from those with much less knowledge of the field. For example, teachers. And if you are teachers here, you know what it's like to get criticized by the parents and by the, it's kind of hard. It's kind of like, teaching kindergarten and then letting them evaluate you and determine what the curriculum should be, next month. Or, it's hard. I mean, it's not an easy thing. Well, elders live in that world and rightly expect ministers to receive evals. The most helpful response to thoughtful input is thank you. I appreciate your suggestions. Then pull away, set goals, share those goals with your elders, and work the plan. What about low professional accountability to the church? This is another one. Ministers sometimes say, I work for God, not the church. Elders chafe at this, realizing that while there is a transcendent call for ministry, it's also true that some aspects of congregational work are tied to responsiveness to church need. When I was at Johnson, one of my colleagues, fellow professor, had this chapel speech that he delivered called That Special Piece of Paper. And what he meant was there's a special piece of paper that comes to those who are engaged in ministry. It's usually once a month that has letters, numbers, and signatures on it. And if you want one of those, you have to pay the rent. Now, he's borrowing a term that's kind of frequent among ministers. Pay the rent is a term that James D. Glass used in a book back in 1969 called Putting It Together in the Parish. It was a practical book on practical ministry where he said this: rent, the baseline expectations that your church has of you for them to perceive that you're earning your keep, that your consumption is not outweighing your contribution, that you're pulling your own row, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. In other words, you're a good employee, right? Okay? Now, in that respect, and one of the things that my colleague used to say is, every one of us, every career, every work has those things that are sort of baseline. And a lot of times with my students, what I will encourage them to do is to ask questions like, what things at the end of a given week or month or year do you want me to be able to say I have done in order for you to believe I've done my work, I've done my job? And it varies from church to church. So one church I was with, the visitation expectation was very significant. It was beyond what I could do. Another church, they laid it out very carefully. We actually put it in the working agreement. If there's a member of our church in the hospital, we want you to be there at least once each week that they're in the hospital. Anybody else, it's your choice to go see them or not to go see them. Now, I thought that was nice of them to say that, and they actually were consistent with it over time. But do you see, in a sense, what they were doing is they were defining rent, okay? And in some respects, that is important. Well, how then do you derive that? Some of the strategies and best practices, if you look there to the right, ministers seek clarity described in the sections above on work descriptions, which I'll get to that when we start talking about ministers. Every minister needs a work description. And it's usually better, by the way, to let the ministers write the drafts and present them to you and let you look over them with him, because ministers understand what they do better than what elders understand what they do. And so it's usually better for them to write the drafts and present it to you, and then you have negotiations and discussions about it. Seek that clarity and recognize that once a person is perceived as a rent plus participant and earns the credibility of hard work, the church is likely to give liberty and to exhibit the professionalism of showing up, managing time, setting a good example, and responding to others. Okay? Now, go next. This next one is big. It is big. Poor monitoring of image and influence, especially on politics and social media. The description. Ministers may fail to respect local traditions of dress, grooming, and manner that enhance credibility. Okay. There are some things that you just need to do because it fits that context. And you really don't benefit anyone by trying to make a statement otherwise. An example of this. I've been preaching the last several weeks at a church over in Middle Tennessee that's in between preachers. And so in one of my first texts to the elder, who was sort of my contact elder, as I said, I was planning to wear a quarter zip with a dress shirt and a pair of slacks. Will that work? He said, at our church, you're going to need to wear a coat and tie because the song leader and the preacher are sort of expected to wear a coat and tie. I had to go out and buy a 17 neck shirt because my 16 and a halves don't fit me anymore without choking. No, I didn't have to buy it. My wife had already bought me one. Okay, all right. So I had to wear a tie and a jacket. Okay, and I did that because I respect that church. Well, I think ministers sometimes believe that they're making a faith statement, that they're making a mission statement about being open to everyone and that sort of thing. I understand that. I get it. But that is determined so locally, and it's important to respect the local standard, whatever that standard is. Just do it. Just do it. Just, hold your nose. Get one of those shirts that button at the top. Put a tie on. Get a jacket that fits. Okay, and wear it. Now, it may not be that. It may be something completely different. All right. Now, also in that respect, ministers sometimes dichotomize between their professional roles connected to the church and their behavior in other arenas. They may fail to show discretion over their public influence, especially in social media. Connected to this is failure to exercise restraint and good timing in openly sharing opinions on controversial matters. Now, I will have to admit, if I were a preacher right now, I'd probably struggle with that. That would be, a bit of a challenge for me. But let me illustrate it. During COVID, at a church, during the election, the minister was extremely open about his support for a particular platform, party, and candidate. Now you would think, well, he's welcome to his own opinion. Perhaps, but here's the thing. As soon as he does that, the church polarizes around him. Now, can he have his convictions? Yes. But there are times when leaders need to understand they need to relinquish their right to posture. Because when they do it, they make it difficult for half of their congregation to receive what they say. It's usually better for those kinds of conversations to occur in context where it's relatively safe and the people who are with you are relatively mature and they can receive your understanding of things without it creating difficulty for them. And most of us as ministers know who those mature people are in our churches, and they're usually kind of our S&S cafeteria group or whatever your restaurant is. Your IHOP group. That was my restaurant today. Those are the ones you socialize with, and you have special relationships with them. They can receive that sort of thing. But sometimes, especially in our highly, highly polarized era right now, it's better to lay low on that sort of thing and use your venues to be completely constructive for as many possible people and to not do anything that gets in the way. Well, so I've sort of jumped into my sense of strategies there. There in that next column, within reason, ministers adjust their styles to the context. Missionaries adjust to the context, not the other way around. Ministers, as public leaders, have to filter their behavior through how it reflects upon the church, their families, their roles. Like other public leaders in education, government, and corporations, it's said that their lives are not strictly their own. And for ministers, the stakes are higher, potentially affecting their capacity to minister the gospel impartially. And remember, credibility is hard won, easily lost. Do nothing to embarrass or diminish trust. And this is especially important on social issues. Your people will follow every comment on social media, so keep it constructive. Okay. Then, this next one. Again, we're talking about tension points as elders perceive them. Okay. Guild-centered content that is largely irrelevant to one's ministry setting. guild-centered content. Okay? Ministers, especially those who are seminary trained, may unconsciously prepare sermons with their guild audience in mind. That is, other preachers and respected professors, without realizing how technical and pastorally ineffective they are. Now, I plead guilty. I used to consider it a compliment, when people would come to me and say, your preaching is just really dense. It's just so content-filled. I thought, yeah, good. We have to get out the dictionary at home after your sermon. I really wasn't meaning to do that. I was preaching the material as I got it from the sources, right? And I was trying to make application. It wasn't that I didn't make application. I want to tell you what got me on that is when I moved back to a church where I used to be the preacher after having been gone for a couple of years and started sitting in the pew. And I heard preachers who preached like me. And I realized these people don't have any idea what you're talking about. And I said that one. I looked over there and said, they don't know what he's talking about. She said, right. She said, bingo. Because she tried to tell me that a few times. I was thinking, no, they understand it. This is a university church. They get it. She said, no, they don't. She said, and you don't get it if you can't take it down. You know. Actually, my wife would never say that. It was my daughter who said that. She would say that. Okay. But being able to bring it down, okay? Some solutions on that. Ministers know they should preach to the needs of their churches. They may need help, however, in realizing when they become overly technical. Seek that help from trusted friends and family members. Now, here's another thing. Ministers need outlets for that content, though. They do. They need outlets for it. They need opportunities to just wax elephants on something that's just really, really important to them, where they're doing some really heavy, rich study. And there's going to be people at the church who are interested in that. Let your minister teach those Bible classes occasionally. Let them just go deep. Let them talk about, let them talk about all that stuff. Let them quote N.T. Wright. Let them, get into all that, and because, it kind of floats their boat. They enjoy doing it. So give them an opportunity to do that. And if it's a podcast or they're doing some seminars or whatever the case might be, or they got a group of preachers coming and they just kind of share with each other along those lines, they need that outlet. And by the way, it keeps them fresh, because that's how they stay fresh. It isn't that you cut that off, it's that you help them be able to bridge that gap. Now, that's just a few things that I could say about tension points as elders perceive them. Now, I know there are more, we wouldn't stick just to that, okay? But nonetheless, those are some pieces that I would mention. So I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes just among yourselves, just to chat and to think about which one of these do you think has manifested where you are, or maybe not just where you are, but you've seen it, you're aware of it. Which one of these was especially poignant for you? Maybe not just one, okay? And just chat a little among yourselves, and here in just a few minutes I'll call us back and we'll look at another piece of this. This is not a break, by the way. This is a discussion. I haven't given you a break yet. 2 more minutes? 2 more minutes. Thirty seconds. 30 seconds remaining. Okay. 10 seconds. Okay, let's reconvene. Now, I want to shift gears here for just a little bit and go for, maybe 10, a little more minutes, then we'll do a break, okay, and we'll come back after that. Let's talk about this dynamic as perceived and experienced by the ministers, but there's one of them that is sort of closely related to what I just discussed from the elders, okay? And it's on page 4, the third one up from the bottom. You see the one that I've labeled as different definitions of work ethic? You see that? Okay. Different definitions of work and work ethic. And again, this is kind of closely related, sometimes elders punctuating it, sometimes ministers punctuating it, okay? Elders, even if they do not understand minister roles, still operate with baseline expectations, often unstated, to judge the minister as earning their keep or paying their rent, which we've already talked about. Ministers, on the other hand, face the reality of juggling work and family, etc., and may see rent differently. For example, if visitation went to 11 p.m., is it okay to show up at 10 a.m. the next day? Okay. Perceptions of ministers and elders may mismatch. A lot of times they do. And I've encountered ministers who will say, work-life balance. I was in an elders meeting last night until about 11:30. I just, needed a little downtime, and so I just, I took it a little slower this morning and showed up at 10 a.m. Well, they have to be careful with that because the same elders who were in the room had to show up at work at 5 a.m. the next day. And so that can create tension. That can create difficulty. It's not a matter of making it to where the ministers have to live according to the same standard as the elders or vice versa. That's not the point. It's a matter of being clear. It's a matter of there being some understanding. Now, typically speaking, you don't even have to address this, okay? It's only when it becomes an issue that you often have to address it. And so my suggestion, as part of the above, which is work descriptions that we will get to, ministers seek a good definition of rent that balances missional priorities, healthy self-care, and family needs, then pay rent. Liberty to define one's ministry is always tied to the perception of stakeholders that your contribution matches and preferably exceeds your consumption. And then use a standardized eval process to be able to help with that. So I realize that it goes on both sides, okay? But I wanted to mention that connection with following up on what we just talked about relative to elders. Now, let's come to page 1. And let's begin to discuss here this problem as it's often experienced by the ministers. Now, why is there more bulk here? It's because the ministers bring it up more often. Okay, that's number one. And it may actually be that it may actually be that there is this proportion. I just don't know. I've not talked with many elders who address this or who have felt the need to address it, and it most often comes from the ministers. So I realize it's not proportional. There's more stuff here in terms of the way the ministers experience it than the elders. In future iterations of this, it may be more balanced. I don't know. But for right now, I do know these are issues that ministers experience. And so it's helpful for us to hear this. First one, the elders maintaining a hierarchical, not necessarily authoritarian, view of their role over the employed minister. Now, here's the way I would describe it. Elders and ministers may aspire to an empowering perspective that welcomes ministerial leadership while actually operating from a hierarchical pyramid-shaped belief system. So you may structure your way of doing things to where it looks as if everybody's empowered, but still in reality, in the minds of the elders, their belief system is still very hierarchical and pyramid-shaped. Okay? And they have a tendency to see ministers somewhere below them as paid employees who carry out the directives of the elders. Now, here's the issue on this. Most elders, when they read this statement, can sometimes look at about half of it and say, well, what's wrong with that?
Amen.
Okay, all right, yeah. Well, let's look a little more closely at that. Some suggested best practices. Replace superiority and hard authority with the New Testament preference for relational, servant-oriented spiritual leadership. Try to stay away from power-based, authority-based language relative to your roles. It isn't to say that authority doesn't exist. It is to say that it is of a different kind. And to acknowledge the non-biblical origins of hierarchical belief systems. And I've got a little footnote there if you want to read a little more on that. Look at Ian Fair's book that he wrote, Leadership in the Kingdom. Look at the way he describes what he thinks is the historical backdrop to the hierarchical belief systems relative to the way churches function. I mean, he attributes it to Episcopal, Anglican, and Roman Catholic understandings of congregational life as it's trickled down into the American psyche. I don't know whether, but here was a man who wrote the book well into his 70s as a shepherd, as an elder, and was trying to help people understand things. And so there's a little credibility there, I think, as he was going through this. And also to accurately interpret the New Testament regarding the cooperation with leaders, that's 1 Thessalonians 2, Hebrews 13, and appointed roles, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, as inclusive of both elders and ministers. Here's what I really sincerely ask you to do this, to read with an open mind and to understand texts like Hebrews chapter 13. Obey your leaders and submit to them. Okay, that's the NIV translation of that. Who are the leaders that's being referred to there? Go back up to verse 7 and some of the other texts in there, and you find It's fundamentally those who spoke the word of God to them and others, the very kind of role we ascribe to our ministers. There's really not a hard and fast distinction there between roles. It's a function within the church that the Hebrews writer is talking about there. It's the function of leading. And he's saying to those in the church, those who lead you, cooperate with them so that their work will be a joy, not a burden. And it means a minister, it means an elder, it means pretty much anyone. In fact, by the way, if it is ever translated, obey your leaders and submit to them, you have to understand that that's a special construction. Even, okay, here I go getting technical on you. Okay. Yeah, I know Greek. Let me throw a Greek word at you here. Yeah. No, not quite. But there is a little construction there in that text that actually uses one of the softest terms you can use for the conveyance of authority. It's one of the softest terms you can use. It actually is, it comes from a root meaning to persuade, and it's the idea of be persuaded by. Be persuaded by your leaders. Now, that does not mean that you can hold out support if they don't persuade you. That's not the point. The onus is not put on the elders to be persuasive. Are you seeing that? That's not where the pressure is put. The onus is placed upon the people to be easy to lead. You get that? That's where the onus is put on the people, to be easy to lead. All right? But there's really no big distinction there as to who's supposed to be submitted to. It's just anybody who leads you, submit to them. Same way, 1 Thessalonians, that text in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, obey, cooperating with your leaders. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and others we could look at. Look, guys, I mean, there's nothing that is role specific. It is function specific when the church is called upon to cooperate with their leaders. Then get to 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, all right? Now, I know this is going to sound a little reductionistic, but there's some truth to this, okay? It's just hard for me to imagine, and it should be hard for you to imagine, Timothy and Titus appointing elders, then turning around and saying, okay, tell me how to do my work. I mean, do you see that in the pastoral letters? It's just not there. In fact, what you find is Timothy and Titus are training elders and appointing them and then training other people to be more elders. And then helping the elders to come alongside them and train more people to lead and so on. It's this mentoring process that's going on, this developmental process. I just can't imagine. It's really hard for me to imagine that tension existing between Timothy and Titus and the elders they appointed. That's just really, really difficult for me to fathom. The role distinction is just not very strong. And do you realize, get this, guys, the only time the word for hard authority is used in the entire New Testament with reference to spiritual leadership is the word exousia. Now, I think this is right. I did investigate it once, and it stuck in my head, so I hope it is still true. Okay. I think the only time that the word for hard authority is used in the New Testament with a function of leadership, it is command and teach these things with all authority. Somebody may need to look at it on that. Is it exousia? I think it is. I believe it is. But it's a hard word that's used there. It's one of these words where it's a really hard currency of authority. And who has it? It's the preacher. It's Titus. Titus 2 is where it is said, where it's used in that way. It's Titus who said, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with all patience and careful instruction. I mean, there is this sense of authority that is given. Now, the last thing I'm wanting to encourage from this presentation is ministers going back home, shaking this thing in front of the elders, say, right here. No, I'm not encouraging that because it's a cooperative relationship. I mean, some of the, it grieves me when I hear things about elders having difficulty with their ministers and not understanding why they can't get them to do what they're doing. Said, well, we went to him and we talked to him about this, okay? And I said, how long has it been since you guys met? Well, we don't meet very regularly, but we went to him about 6 months ago, and we had a good, 30-minute meeting with him, and we discussed it very clearly. And I'm thinking, man, you guys are really missing out. The elders and ministers are just missing out being in each other's presence and learning and benefiting from each other in that way. Now, when push comes to shove, who makes the decisions? Well, honestly, guys, I think you've got choices that you can make there on local level. I do. I think elders and ministers can decide if they wish to in their particular local context that the elders and ministers as a team make the decision. I think you can do that. I don't think there's one thing in the scriptures that would forbid that. In fact, if anything, there's more to encourage it than not to encourage it. Now, if on the other hand, the elders say, well, we listen, we take everyone into account, but we vote among ourselves. I don't know many ministers who would be just really uncomfortable with that, provided they have a place at the table. And you've listened to them. You've taken their expertise into account. How it works out locally, even if you want to give your minister, because of trust and expertise and capability, a significant degree of individual authority, I think even that can be entirely appropriate as well. I think it just depends on the kind of arrangement that you make with each other. And I know some churches of Christ, they're doing that right now. It's working really well. Others, where they've tried that, it's not working well because the minister doesn't know how to execute authority. He's not a good manager, so he really doesn't know how to do it. He's not trained to do it. So it's kind of like square peg in a round hole. He's a great teacher, great preacher, but you put him over the staff, he doesn't know how to manage the staff. He doesn't know how many books you read. It'd be like teaching the pig to sing. He can read every book on management that there is out there, but he's never going to be able to do it because he's not wired that way. Let it operate on the basis of collective giftedness and the capability of the people that are in the room. But, bringing that team of people together is what we're talking about here. Anyone, minister or elder, who wants to define their role fundamentally in terms of structural power is standing on very shaky ground. Because there's nothing in Scripture about it. In fact, it's the opposite. Okay? Next little thing that I'll mention, then we're going to take a real break here. The minister underrepresented at the leadership table. Now, that's directly related to what I just said, so I'll go over it pretty quickly. Elders and ministers meet more separately than together, or when they do meet together, the ministers are not included in important matters of congregational direction or policy. A good way to address that, elders and ministers find a good stride in the inhale-exhale of meeting separately and together in the way that best suits their context and allows robust participation from ministers. And then one more thing before we break here. Failure to recognize and utilize the expertise of the minister. Look at the way I've described it. Ministers have considerable exposure to best practices of church leadership. The literature is vastly beyond what most elders imagine. The call I get sometimes from elders is, there's nothing written on that. And I'm thinking, there's a website out there, lifeandleadership.com. I want you to go to that subject and look at the list of books that this nerd preacher put on there for you to see how many times it's addressed by how many authors, and that list is 10 years old. It's my website, so I send them there all the time. The literature on ministry leadership is vast. I mean, it's huge. I mean, there's so many books, and I can't even keep up with all of them. I'm supposed to keep up with them because I train demons. D-men, doctors of ministry. Demons. That's the only push I'm going to give for recruitment. That's just that one little, just a little. But if you want to do it, if you want to become a demon, come let me know. Okay. But the literature is just so significant. And here's what happens. Ministers spend a lot of time with that literature. They do. I mean, they spend lots of time with it. Now, Secondly, Churches of Christ historical identity struggles with ministry professionalization. Historically, we've always struggled with that. I mean, it goes back to post-Civil War days. And it has a highly independent spirit that overestimates the ability to address faith complexities. This, alongside popular level Christian literature, results in elders assuming adequate self-education and little need for those with specialized training. Hear me carefully, guys. Once you get beyond 125 or 150, a congregation is too complex for a group of volunteer, untrained people to lead it. You need specialized help. You need knowledge that goes outside of the collective wisdom. It's just more complex. I used to say 200 or more. Okay? I used to say, because that was kind of this break point that churches become not quite family, a little more corporate, and they're sort of in that awkward size. I would say today 100 to 150, and here's the reason why. The level of ideological complexity and polarization and such within our churches has grown so significantly that once you get to that 150 mark, who is it? Malcolm Gladwell talks about Dunbar's rule of 150. That is sort of the maximum number that you can engage real deep social community. There's kind of that breaking point. Now, part of what that means is once you get beyond that, up to that point beyond it, your people are no longer gathering because they're in agreement with each other a lot on stuff. It's no longer homogenous. Okay? Now, we might even argue that it doesn't take that many. But to the extent that your group is no longer homogenous and reflects sort of the diversity of the culture at large, there's a complexity to it that takes somebody in the room. I'm not saying he has to just guide everything, but it takes somebody in the room who's spending time with some of that specialized literature and who has some training to come and bless the group and let the group have the benefit of his knowledge. And we can say, well, we don't want professional ministers, whatever the case might be. It's nice to have an educated minister sometimes on that particular issue who's read some of the best material out there and who would be thrilled to come and give you a 10 or 12 page executive summary of a really great book that's been written on that. Okay. Sometimes elders fail to understand the large network and deep connections within the Church of Christ ministry community that provides awareness and resources beyond their collective. That networking is pretty deep. And so some strategies: respect the unusually high level of training that our Christian college education ministers possess. Churches of Christ have proportionally more seminaries than a lot of groups with a strong Stone Campbell tradition of higher education. Do not overvalue independence such that it excludes the input of those with focused educations on ministry-related disciplines. Welcome and seek out minister expertise and their network of resources. Periodically ask them to provide updates on current literature. Go with them to workshops. Learn and act on the good ideas they bring to the table. And ministers, be humble in the sharing. Okay, now, let's take a break. It's 4 o'clock right now. And I believe I was told I have until 4:45. Right? Okay. So let's take a break. 10, 15 minutes. Kind of reminds me of one time when a guy led a prayer at the church where I preached. I had a collection of letters from him over the ideal length of a sermon. And he said, Lord, we thank you that you let us gather here for fellowship and for singing your praises and hearing a message from your word until 11:30 or 11:35 or 11:45 or so. He really said that. I said, okay. All right, so let's take a break. I'll call you back. Okay.